Greetings, I am Reverend Dewey McCormick, Head Minister of Enduzan, Perfect Dragon Mountain, Shinganji, True Vow Temple, of the Nichiren Shu Sangha of the San Francisco Bay Area. In this presentation of 4 parts, it is my goal to cover those things about the life and teachings of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha that Nichiren Shu expects its clergy to know. I feel that this might also be of interest to dedicated lay practitioners, as well as those who are curious about Buddhism and would like to know more about its founder and the basic teachings and practices that he taught. I will note that material appearing in red rather than black is material that is either not covered or not covered in detail in the book History and Teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, published by the Nichiren Shu Text Editorial Committee. This is material that I personally feel is important for Nichiren Buddhist practitioners to be familiar with, especially clergy and lay teachers. Now let's begin the first of the 4 parts, the place and time of the historical Buddha. Though I will be drawing upon many sources for this presentation, it will primarily be following the points covered in the first chapter, Shakyamuni Buddha's Life and Teachings, of the History and Teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, from Shakyamuni Buddha through Nichiren Shonin to the present, published by the Nichiren Shu Text Editorial Committee. I will also be drawing upon material from my book Open Your Eyes, a Nichiren Buddhist View of Awakening, which is available on Amazon, from various articles that I've written over the last 20 years about the life and teachings of the Shakyamuni Buddha, which can be found at nichirenbayarea.org. I have also drawn upon other articles about the life and teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, but particularly the life of the Buddha, according to the Pali Canon by the Venerable Bhikkhu Nanamoli, the Sutta translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Connected Discourses of the Buddha, a translation of the Samyutta Nikaya by Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Long Discourses of the Buddha, a translation of the Digha Nikaya by Maurice Walsh, the Canonical Book of the Buddha's Lengthy Discourses, Volume 1, translated by Shohei Ichimura, and an article on the dates of the Buddha by Joshu J. Mark, and the article Did the Buddha Die of Mesenteric Infarction by the Venerable Metanando Bhikkhu. To begin with, the word Buddha is actually a title which means awakened one, because a Buddha is one who has awakened to the Dharma or truth that sets one free from suffering. In the Buddhist tradition, there is not just one Buddha, though there can only be one Buddha per world per dispensation of the Dharma. By dispensation of the Dharma, we mean a period wherein the Dharma is taught by a Buddha, the teaching goes through a period of flourishing, and then gradually disappears in the world until another Buddha appears to once again turn the wheel of the Dharma. The Buddha of this world in this current dispensation of the Dharma is Shakyamuni, whose name means Sage of the Shakya clan, because he was born as Siddhartha Gautama to the Shakya clan in northern India around 2,500 years ago. Traditionally, there are 10 epithets or 10 honorable titles that could also be used to refer to the Buddha. The first of these is Tathagata, which means thus come one. This Sanskrit title can also mean thus gone one. It refers to the one who can come and go freely from the realm of truth. The second is Arhat, which means worthy of respect, also a title shared with those who hear the Buddha's teachings and free themselves of the defilements that compel sentient beings to undergo the sufferings of birth and death. Samyak Sambuddha, which means perfectly awakened one. Vidya Charana Sampanna, perfect in knowledge and conduct. Sugata, which means well gone, as in well gone from the sufferings of birth and death. Lokavid, knower of the secular world. Anuttara, unsurpassed. Purusha Dhamya Sorati, the trainer of people. Shasta Deva Manushyanam, the teacher of gods and men. And finally, Bhagavat, the world-honored one. Before discussing the Buddha's life and teachings, we must understand the cultural context within which the historical Shakyamuni Buddha lived and taught. The culture that the Buddha was raised in can be said to have had its earliest roots in the culture of the Indus Valley civilizations. They were composed of ethnic groups such as the Dravidians, Mundas, and others, which go back as far as the 34th century BCE. The Indus Valley civilization is known for its large and well-planned cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. However, these cities were abandoned and the Indus Valley civilization collapsed by the 14th century BCE, most likely due to climate change that created more arid conditions. It is believed the people of these civilizations migrated east to the Ganges basin. Many believe that the practice of yogic concentration and contemplative practice may have been developed by the Indus Valley civilization due to the finding of seals depicting a male figure sitting in the lotus posture. Beginning in the 15th century until the 10th century BCE, cattle-breeding nomads calling themselves the Aryans or nobles migrated south from the Central Asian steppes into the Punjab area of what is now eastern Pakistan and northwestern India. By the time of the Buddha, they had established the so-called 16 major states on the Ganges plain. These 16 major countries or states, the Mahajanapadas, were Anga, which is the easternmost country. Magadha is just to the west of Anga. The Bodhi tree under which the Buddha sat was in this country, whose capital is Rajagriha, outside of which is Vulture Peak. Kashi is to the west of Magadha. The deer park near its capital Varanasi, where the Buddha began teaching or turning the wheel of the Dharma, was in this country. Koshala is north of Kashi. The Shakya clan that the Buddha was born into were a small but wealthy state in Koshala, in what is today the Tarai region of southern Nepal. The Buddha eventually gained a third of the people of its capital, Shravasti, as lay followers, and earned the respect of another third. So from the 20th year of his teaching on, the Buddha spent his rainy season retreats there, usually at the Jetavana Grove Monastery. Vriji is just north of Magadha. It was a tribal confederation governed as a republic. Its capital was Vaishali. Mala is north of Kashi and west of Vriji. It was also a tribal confederation. It had two capitals, Pava, where the Buddha ate his last meal, and Kushinagara, where Shakyamuni Buddha entered his final nirvana under the sal trees. Chedi is southwest of Kashi. Vatsa is west of Kashi and north of Chedi. Kuru is to the northwest of the other central countries. Panchala is southeast of Kuri and west of Koshala. Ashvaka or Ashmaka is in the south. Avanti, the homeland of Purna and Mahakatyayana, is north of Ashvaka, but to the west of Chedi. Matsya is north of Avanti. Surasena is east of Matsya and west of Vatsa. Gandhara is to the northwest of the central countries. And finally, Kamboja is northwest of Gandhara. To understand the variety of spiritual practices and teachings in India, both prior to Buddhism and those which developed afterwards, it is best to begin with the Vedas. The Vedas are the sacred hymns and teachings of the Aryan people that were brought into India when they migrated into the subcontinent around 1500 BCE. The Vedas were not a written text at that time, and even today are passed on as an oral transmission. They were believed to be a revelation, or in Sanskrit, Shruti, which means what is heard, given to the ancient seers, or rishi, and passed on to the Brahmins, the priests of the Aryans. There are 4 Vedas. The Rig Veda, which means knowledge of verses. This Veda contained the original sacred hymns of the Aryans. The Sama Veda, which means knowledge of songs. This Veda arranges the hymns for chanting during rituals. The Yajur Veda, which means knowledge of sacrifice. This Veda arranges the hymns along with prose passages for use in rituals. And the Atharva Veda, which means knowledge of the fire priest. This later Veda, compiled between 1200 and 1000 BCE, contains many spells for worldly ends. Collectively, the Vedas express the wonder, hopes, and fears of the Aryans. They were the poetic link that made it possible for people to commune with the divine order of the universe and its representatives. As Vedic society evolved, so did the Vedas. Or rather, the Vedas grew as new materials were added that could accommodate the new ideas and insights that came to be associated with the Vedic hymns and rituals. The 4 strata of the Vedas are the Samhitas, are a collection of mantras and hymns that were composed between 1700 and 900 BCE. The Brahmanas, the ritual commentaries of the Brahmanas, were composed between 800 and 600 BCE. The philosophical commentaries of the Aranyakas, which were composed between 600 and 500 BCE. And finally, the philosophical commentaries of the Upanishads that began to appear as early as 800 to 500 BCE and continued to be composed into the 12th century of the Common Era. In the Upanishads, one finds an earnest quest for the deepest and most liberating truth. According to their sacred scripture, the Rig Veda, the primeval cosmic man was divided into parts that became the four classes, or varna, meaning color or complexion, of Vedic society that described social functions and duties. First, there were the Brahmins, who were the priests and scholars. Next were the Kshatriyas, who were the warriors and administrators, the nobles. Then came the Vaishyas, who were the farmers, merchants, and artisans, the commoners. And then the Shudras, who were the laborers and servants. Ideally, these four classes are an attempt to organize society according to the inclinations of the individual. Each person should take up one of those four roles in accordance with their talents and desires. In reality, heredity, in Sanskrit jati, literally birth, came to decide which class a person belonged to. And naturally, the Aryans belonged to the first three classes. These first three classes are known as the twice-born, because their members are all born again when they undergo an initiation ceremony, whereupon they become full members of Vedic society and receive a sacred thread to signify their status. The servants, who were not permitted to study the Vedas or participate in Vedic sacrifices, were composed of the indigenous population. In the 15th century, the Portuguese called these hereditary lineages casta, which became the English word caste. By that time, there were approximately 2,000 professions based on caste. Marriage and fraternization between these castes were strictly forbidden. The system was not nearly so rigid or even uniformly established at the time of the Buddha. Beginning around the time of the Buddha until the 3rd century BCE, 6 schools of thought centered on the Vedas were established. These were the Mimamsa, the school of critical inquiry, was established by Jaimini around 400 BCE. The Mimamsa analyzes the Vedas to justify and regulate the Vedic sacrifices. The Vedanta, or the end of the Vedas, it can be said to have begun with Bhadrayana's Vedanta Sutras that were compiled around 400 BCE. Vedanta focuses on the Upanishads and is aimed at knowledge leading to liberation. The Vaisheshika, or the school of particularists, was established by Kanada Kashyapa around the 3rd century BCE. Kanada was also known as Ulaka, which is how Nietzsche then refers to him as one of the 3 hermits of India. Vaisheshika is devoted to the analysis of Vedic cosmology. Nyaya, or the school of methodologists, was established by Gautama, no relation to Siddhartha, around the 2nd century BCE. Nyaya focuses on logic and epistemology and soon became linked to the Vaisheshika school. Yoga, which means yoking or union, it is a school of meditative practice represented by the 8-limbed yoga of Patanjali, who may have taught his aphorisms as early as 150 BCE. Yoga focuses on attaining samadhi, or union, in order to attain liberation. And finally, Samkhya, or the school of enumerators, which focuses on the cosmological views of yogic practice. The original founder of Samkhya is said to have been Kapila, who may have lived as early as the 7th century BCE. He is one of the 3 hermits of India that Nietzsche refers to in his writings. At the time of the Buddha, there were also 6 famous teachers who rejected, as the Buddha would, the authority of the Vedas. These 6 teachers were part of a large movement of people known as strivers, or in Sanskrit, shramanas, who renounced the household for a life of mendicancy and asceticism in order to attain liberation from the cycle of birth and death. They were also called the Tirthika, or ford makers. The Buddhist tradition would refer to them as the 6 teachers of the outside path, because what they taught was outside the Buddha Dharma. These 6 teachers were Nirgrantha Jnatiputra, the current teachers of the Jains at the time of the Buddha, He taught that our actions bind us to suffering regardless of our intentions, and that only complete inaction and nonviolence can lead to liberation. The original founder of Jainism was supposed to have been Rishabha, the first of the 24 teachers of the present era of the world, according to the Jains. Nietzsche then refers to him as one of the three hermits. Purana Kashyapa, who denied the law of cause and effect. Kakuda Katyayana, the pluralist who taught that the elements that make up life disperse at death with no continuity. It is said that he taught that one could indulge in hedonism, since there is no karma or rebirth. Mascarin Goshaliputra, who taught that everything is predestined, and therefore there are no moral laws, and that strivers can make a living through ajivika, or dishonest means, such as fortune-telling and other practices, that the Buddha considered wrong livelihood on the part of his monks and nuns. Ajita Keshakambala, a teacher of materialism, which in Sanskrit is called the philosophy of lokayatika, or worldliness. Sanjaya Vairatiputra, who advocated skepticism. Before joining the Sangha, Shariputra and Madhyayana were among his followers. Nietzsche then and his contemporaries believed that these 6 teachers gave rise to 95 or 96 schools that all came down to the false view regarding causation. The numbers 95 or 96 are found in various sutras to simply indicate the great variety of views that were held or potentially could be held by the Buddha's contemporaries. The Supreme Net Discourse puts the number at 62 by combining different metaphysical positions regarding past, present, and future, the finite or infinite nature of the world, whether or not there is life after death, and so on. These 62 false views were all based on speculations about the nature of life, based on a limited view of time, and thus a limited view of the workings of causes and conditions. The 95 or 96 schools express more of the same. The Buddha, however, taught that not only were such metaphysical speculations and philosophical debate, as represented by the 62 or 95 schools of thought, fruitless, it was actually a pernicious waste of time. Those who engaged in it would be much better off cultivating the means to attain direct knowledge for themselves. The most famous example of the Buddha's teaching in regard to philosophical speculation is, of course, the parable of the poisoned arrow in the Chula Malunkya Sutta. In this discourse, the monk Malunkyaputta decides that he will leave the Sangha if the Buddha does not give his opinion in regard to the following speculative views. Is the world unchanging or eternal, or impermanent? Is the world finite or infinite? Are the soul and body separate or the same? Does a Tathagata exist after death or not? Does a Tathagata both exist and not exist after death, or neither exist nor not exist after death? The Buddha, however, replies, if anyone should say thus, I will not lead the holy life under the Blessed One until the Blessed One declares to me the world is eternal, or after death a Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist, that would still remain undeclared by the Tathagata, and meanwhile that person would die. Suppose, Malunkyaputta, a man were wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, brought a surgeon to treat him. The man would say, I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know whether the man who wounded me was a noble or a Brahmin, or a merchant or a worker. And he would say, I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, and so on, until I know whether the shaft that wounded me was wild or cultivated, until I know with what kind of sinew the shaft that wounded me was bound, and so on. All this would still not be known to that man, and meanwhile he would die. So too, Malunkyaputta, if anyone should say thus, I will not lead the holy life under the Blessed One until the Blessed One declares to me the world is eternal, all the way up to the question after death a Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist, that would still remain undeclared by the Tathagata, and meanwhile that person would die. The Buddha then drives home the point by stating that what really matters is living the holy life in accordance with the Four Noble Truths, since the question of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the eightfold path to its cessation are of primary importance. The resolution of metaphysical questions can wait until after the most pressing issues addressed by the Four Noble Truths have been resolved, and at that point, one may be well beyond the need to know such things. It should be recalled at this point that all of the Buddha's teachings are based upon his direct experience of the true nature of reality, and that these teachings are for the purpose of enabling his disciples to have the same insight themselves. The Buddha's enlightenment was not a matter of esoteric knowledge that could be communicated in words. Rather, it was an insight into the true nature of reality, which everyone must arrive at for themselves. The Buddha's teachings are simply ways of helping people to mature morally, intellectually, and spiritually to the point where they can do this for themselves. They point to the insight, but they cannot provide the insight that leads to liberation. Many of the metaphysical speculations in the Buddha's day boil down to the views of eternalism or annihilationism. The view of existence, or eternalism, imagines that fixed entities, independent of causes and conditions, and immune from change, can be found underlying the phenomena that do change. The view of non-existence or annihilationism imagines there is no continuity at all within change, and that entities that do arise will eventually vanish completely without a trace. The Buddha consistently taught dependent origination as the middle way between the extremes of existence and non-existence. Dependent origination is the middle way which cuts through those views by pointing out the ceaseless interplay of causes and conditions, which is the process of becoming, rather than the eternalism of being or the nihilism of non-being. The middle way points out that while there are no fixed entities, there is a flow of continuity within the process of change. As the Buddha said to Katyayana, "All exists, Katyayana, this is one extreme. All does not exist, this is the second extreme." Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dharma by the middle. What are our sources for the life of the Buddha? Our earliest historical evidence for the Buddha comes from the time of King Ashoka, the third ruler of the Mauryan Empire, who converted to Buddhism and became its greatest patron. He reigned from 268 to 232 BCE. Ashoka's Pillars and Rock Edicts were translated by British scholars in the 19th century. Several of them refer to Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism and reverence for the Dharma. There is also a pillar at Lumbini that commemorates his visit to the birthplace of Shakyamuni Buddha in the 20th year of his reign. The Pali Tipitaka are three baskets, in Sanskrit Tripitaka, consisting of the sutras, the discourses of the Buddha, Vinaya, the record of monastic precepts and procedures, and the Abhidharma, treatises systematizing the Dharma, were written down in Sri Lanka in the year 25 BCE at the Fourth Buddhist Council according to the Theravadan school. Biographical material is found throughout the Tripitaka, but particularly the sutras and the Vinaya. The Mahavagga, our great chapter of the Theravadan Vinaya, contains the narrative of the Buddha's life from the time of his awakening, the conversion and enlightenment experiences of his major disciples and lay supporters, and the early years of the Sangha. This narrative is continued in the Chulavagga, or lesser chapter, which relates events after the Buddha's passing, particularly the first two Buddhist councils. One of the earliest biographies of Shakyamuni Buddha is the Acts of the Buddha, in Sanskrit the Buddha Charita, written in the form of an epic poem by the scholar monk Ashvaghosha in the 2nd century. Only the first half of the poem is extant in Sanskrit, though the entire work has been preserved in Chinese and Tibetan translations. There is also the extensive Play Sutra, in Sanskrit the Lalita Vishtara Sutra, which is a biography of Shakyamuni Buddha. It was initially composed in the 3rd or 4th centuries and translated into Chinese by Dharmaraksha in 308 and again by Divakara in 683. Another early biography is a lineage story, in Pali the Nidana Katha, an introduction to the Jataka stories attributed to the Theravadan scholar monk Buddhaghosa in the 5th century. Then there is the Account of Travel Sutra, a second sutra of the long discourses, the Agamas, corresponding to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. It tells the story of the last year of Shakyamuni Buddha's life up to and including his final nirvana. In East Asian Buddhism, the Buddha's life is sometimes summarized in terms of 8 phases. In Japanese, the term is Hasso Jodo, which literally translates as 8 appearances or characteristics of attaining the way. This method was used to teach to the 4 groups of monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. Nietzsche then occasionally refers to these in his own writings. The 8 phases are: descending into the world from the Tushita heaven. As a bodhisattva or awakening being, the future Buddha spent countless lifetimes accumulating wisdom and merit in order to attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Before his last earthly rebirth, the future Buddha lived in the heaven of contentment, in Sanskrit Tushita, awaiting the right time, place, and family for his final rebirth. Entering Queen Maya's womb, when the right conditions arose, Queen Maya of Kapilavastu had a most singular dream. She dreamed that a six-tusked white elephant holding a white lotus flower in its trunk circled around her 3 times and then entered into her womb. At that moment, Queen Maya conceived the Bodhisattva. Emerging from Queen Maya's womb, Queen Maya gave birth to him painlessly while standing up and holding on to a sal tree branch while visiting the Lumbini garden near Kapilavastu. The legend recounted in Ashvaghosha's Buddhacharita states that immediately upon entering the world, the young Prince Siddhartha took 7 steps and made the following statement: "I am born for awakening, for the good of the world. This is my last birth in the world of phenomena." Alternatively, he said, "I alone am the honored one in all the heavens above and the earth below." This event is celebrated on April 8th in Japanese Buddhism. Leaving home. After witnessing an old man, a sick man, a funeral procession, and a religious mendicant, Prince Siddhartha left his family, his father King Shuddhadana, his wife Yashodhara, and his son Rahula, and became a forest ascetic. Overcoming Mara. After turning away from asceticism, the Bodhisattva sat beneath the Bodhi tree at Bodh Gaya and overcame temptations and distractions of the demon Mara. This phase is not always used. Instead, there is a phase that follows the next phase called the encouragement from Brahma, referring to the Vedic creator god Brahma's entreaties to the newly awakened Buddha to teach the Dharma. Attaining the way. As the morning star, perhaps Venus, rose in the morning sky, the Bodhisattva attained Buddhahood and henceforth became known as Shakyamuni Buddha. This event is celebrated on December 8th in Japanese Buddhism. First turning the wheel of the Dharma. Starting at the deer park near the city of Varanasi, the Buddha began to teach the Dharma. Sometimes this phase is simply titled Turning the Wheel of the Dharma and is meant to include the Buddha's entire 50 years of teaching the Dharma. Entering final nirvana. At the age of 80, the Buddha passed away beneath the twin sal trees near the city of Kushinagara. This event is commemorated on February 15th in Japan. With that, I bring the first part of this 4-part presentation of the life and teachings of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha to a close. I hope that this presentation was helpful and informative and will help to enrich your faith in and practice of Nichiren Buddhism.